Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all well. Hope you're enjoying this almost spring-like weather. At least we're able to get out and get a breath of fresh air and get some exercise, which is good for us all. No announcements from me this afternoon, so I'll go straight into welcoming our speaker, Alyson Aviv. Alyson is a neuropsychological assessment. I think I got that right. What is neurological assessment? Thankfully, we have Alyson Aviv, who is highly qualified professor in clinical psychology and pediatric neuropsychology, to explain to us about her work in both America and Israel. She is the only person in the Middle East to hold these qualifications and sits on the board of Get Help Israel, which is a national mental health organization that serves the English-speaking population in Israel. Alyson assists government subcommittees on their policies that impact on immigrant absorption and the unique needs of immigrant children with mental health issues and learning difficulties. Alyson is well advanced with working with memory functions, which will be extremely relevant to us seniors. So, Alyson, welcome. Delighted to have you all the way from Israel. Over to you.
Thank you. It's actually a real pleasure to be with you all. I grew up in Bushy. Surprisingly, I've lost my English accent. I've been out of England for a very long time. But I grew up very close to where you all are. And I did my undergraduate degree in Israel, and then I went to the States for my doctorate degree and got stuck there for a long time, and now I'm back in Israel. But in the States, my doctoral degree is in clinical psychology. I did a postdoc in neuropsychology and then became board certified. So I also sit on a American board of pediatric neuropsychologists. So I'm involved there in some policy statements and some governmental work there as well. What I want to, or what Joy asked me to do today, was to talk a little bit about what I do. So I'm going to do that and give you a little bit of context and a little bit, especially context about working with multilingual clients, which is what I do out here. I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's see. Okay. So you should be able to see my slides, and I'm going to use these to help sort of direct what I want to talk about today. In the last 7 years since I've been back in Israel, I've really been doing both assessment work and therapy work in a multilingual, multicultural context. I work with children and adults who, most of whom speak more than one language, many immigrant communities from English-speaking countries, and some French immigrants as well. So it actually turns the assessment work into a very interesting endeavor. I've become very interested in language. Most neuropsychologists are interested in language, but I've become very interested in language because I see how difficulty in learning language really affects children when they move countries. And we always think about language as something that if you just work hard enough, you should be able to master it. Well, it turns out that language is a skill. It's a skill that, you know, like other skills that we have, kids are musical or whether our kids are sporty, these are skills that we accept. They're good at music, they're bad at music, they're good at sports, they're not so good at sports, but we don't think about language that way. And the reality is there are lots of people who have a lot of trouble with language. So why is it interesting and important? Well, 50% of the world's population speaks more than one language. And our identity and our culture are completely wrapped up in the language that we speak. I think the best example I can give is raising 4 children in the US. My kids were all born in America. And every summer we used to do a little trip. We would come to visit grandparents in England, and then we'd come to Israel to visit the grandparents in Israel, and then we'd go back to the States. So in America, they were typical American kids. We'd show up in England, and my parents' general approach was, oh goodness, the wild animals are coming, because American children compared to British children are much louder and noisier and more present. And then we'd get to Israel, and their Israeli grandparents would say, these are the best behaved children we have ever come across in the entire world, because Israeli kids are even more obnoxious than American children. So the way that you behave and the way that your behavior is accepted to the people around you is very, very dependent on the culture that you grow up in. And language and culture are very, very highly connected. I think my favorite quote is this one: language is to culture what DNA is to genetics. You can't really divide the two. The therapy work that I do, obviously all therapy work is relational. It has to do with how people interact with each other, and language is crucial to those relationships. I found in my therapy work, when I have a client in the room, because I do assessment work in the mornings where I'm diagnosing difficulties that children and adults are having, and then I do therapy work in the afternoons. I only do therapy with 16-year-olds and above, because by the time I've spent 6 hours, 4 to 6 hours in the morning with smaller children, generally I want to have a little bit of a change in what I'm doing. What is interesting in terms, I've lost my train of thought. I don't know where I was going. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Yeah, the language in therapy is interesting because the language a person speaks in therapy impacts their therapeutic experience. It turns out that people who are multilingual, about a third of them will go and do therapy in a language that is not their mother tongue, which is quite interesting. I have a lot of multilingual therapy clients who, when they're talking about certain subjects, will switch languages because it's easier to talk about certain things in one language than the other. I think my favorite example is a very British woman that I'm working with, who, when she was talking about some of the difficulties she was having in her intimate relationship with her husband, switched to Hebrew. And I noticed it, and I said to her, do you realize you just switched languages? And she said, yes, but I can't talk about sex, I'm British, which I thought was quite amusing. But it was interesting because language really impacts the way that we understand ourselves. We also have language personas. The way I present myself in English is probably different than the way I present myself in Hebrew, but just simply because of the language that I'm speaking. So language work intersects a lot of areas in the literature. I'm often reading in linguistics, in cognition, in social cultural psychology, anthropology. There's work on second language acquisition. It's a fascinating area because it crosses so many different academic areas. Just a quick word about language levels. It's often interesting when we see children, and I don't know whether any of you have children who live in other countries and speak more than one language, or any grandchildren. A lot of kids, when they move to Israel, very quickly pick up spoken Hebrew. So their basic interpersonal communication skills, which is getting out on the playground, playing a game of football, talking to their friends, being able to walk into the corner store and buy a chocolate bar, that interpersonal communication is low-level language, and it comes pretty quickly, 6 months to 2 years, and these kids sound like they were born here. The same goes, by the way, for English-speaking children who were born in Israel, but whose parents come from England, from the States, from South Africa, from Australia. They sound exactly like their parents, but most of their language skills are pretty basic. The second language level that we look at is cognitive academic language proficiency, and this comes from being exposed to subject matter. So kids are only going to pick this up in school when they've really been exposed to lots of different areas of learning, and it takes 5 to 7 years to develop, which is why in most countries, when children come into a school system, they will have accommodations because they're learning in an instructional language that is new to them. And so there are accommodations throughout the system. In Israel, for instance, kids are accommodated all the way through the end of 12th grade in their matriculation exams at different levels of accommodation, less or more help, based on how long they've been in the country. Some of the things that I think about when I'm working with families that come into my clinic and tell me that their kids are struggling and they're trying to figure out why are things like what level of language proficiency they have in Hebrew. Can they read and write? Because some people can speak, but they struggle with reading and writing and spelling. What language they're using at home versus what language they're using at school. And then an issue that I find maybe in Ra'anana is a little different to other places in Israel, because in Ra'anana, apparently you can come here and never learn Hebrew and succeed quite well. Often the parent model we have is that parents say, well, I work in English, I don't really need to learn Hebrew, I can function like this. And so the children learn that it's not so important. And because there's lots of English speakers around them, they often make friends with other English speaking kids, and parents put a lot of emphasis on English, and they don't learn Hebrew at the level that they need to. And sometimes they float through the system quite far until people realize that the Hebrew is pretty lousy. So I think parent models are really important. And I talk to parents a lot about that. You can't be yelling at your kids to go and work harder on the Hebrew if you're not doing anything to improve it yourself. Sometimes parents have some very unrealistic expectations of curricula scope and sequence. What is going to be taught at different stages of the school curriculum, and when it's going to be taught. And the curriculum here and the way classes run in Israel is very, very different to England. Just simple things like the number of kids in a classroom, people's manners. I think my English families struggle the most when they realize that kids call their teachers by their first name, and all kids have their teacher's private phone number on their WhatsApp so that they can access them at all times of the day and night. I'll give you an example of how things are incredibly different. My youngest child, who's 16, seems to be having an awfully hard time getting himself to school in the mornings onto Zoom of late. And so his teacher calls him in the morning to make sure he's woken himself up. I cannot imagine that ever happening in any other country of the world that I've lived in. But there's a very interesting interaction here that's different and very cultural. When I'm working with multilingual, multicultural children, I have to choose what testing instruments I'm going to use. Testing batteries or tests that I use are normed in the place that they were developed. So I have a lot of American instruments. I've got Israeli instruments. I've got, tests that were developed elsewhere, and I have to determine whether the norm base matches that particular child. So I have to understand the cultural norms for the test that I'm using. Behavioral and emotional regulation issues also play a role with multilingual, multicultural children. I'm working with a South African teenager at the moment whose parents grew up in South Africa, and in South Africa, there's a lot more management of your children because of the dangers that exist there. Children don't go out by themselves in the evenings because they're likely to get attacked. And so these parents are very, very protective of their children. And this 16-year-old wants to do what her Israeli friends are doing, which is, obviously COVID puts a little bit of a damper on it, but she wants to go and spend time with her friends. And in Israel, there's no such thing as a curfew. Kids sort of go out, they come back, they manage themselves, they're much more independent. And so there's an issue that's happening there between parents and children. And I see a lot of that in immigrant families where the parents have expectations that just don't match the society that they're raising their children in. So some of it is education. As I said earlier, I think language is really a skill. I think cultural competency is a skill too. And if you don't learn the language of the country you're living in, it's really hard to be culturally competent. I'm not going to talk much about the brain, except just to say the research is really interesting. It turns out that when you learn a second language, the age of learning impacts the type of brain pathways that develop. And the less fluent you are, the more brain activation you need when you're speaking. So it's much more important to be proficient than it is to have known whether someone started learning when they were younger or older. People who have more than one language generally are more efficient in the way that they use their brains. They have better problem-solving skills, better flexibility in the way that they think, and better executive functioning, things like organization and planning and management. Why is that important to think about? Because even seniors can spend lots of time learning second languages. It's great for your brain. I'm quite proud of my mom who's she's finished her Duolingo, her Hebrew Duolingo recently. She worked her way straight through the app. And she's 80 and her Hebrew is pretty fluent. I'm gonna see if I can convince her to pick up a different language now. But if you want to do something to activate your brains, learning another language, and that's a great app that you can download on your iPad or your phone, Duolingo, and you can pick a language and start learning. It's really great for maintaining brain flexibility. What sort of assessments do neuropsychologists do? Well, we do all kinds of assessments. We often will do developmental assessments. Are children developing the way that they should be? Some of those assessments typically revolve around a question about whether a child may have autism or not. Psychological assessments that are dealing with psychological function, adaptation skills, educational assessments. There's this whole thing called psychoeducational assessment. It's sort of a mixture of the two. And then neuropsych assessment, I think, is the most interesting. I do all of these, but the neuropsych assessment takes everything down to its sort of core skill sets. So if I'm looking at a child who is struggling with reading and language, I'm going to be pulling apart their decoding skills. We do that by giving them words that are not real words. We call them non-words. We want to know if they can figure out how to decode without recognizing the actual word. We look at reading speed, we look at reading comprehension, and then we'll go underneath and we'll look at something like a naming skill. If I give them a page of colors, how quickly can they name the colors? That's a retrieval tool, because when we read, we have to very quickly retrieve the information that's in our brain, in our lexicon, in our dictionary. We read a word, we've got to understand what it means, and we do that by associating what we're reading with what we know about that word. So if kids who have a retrieval problem, and we can measure it with what we call an overlearned skill, like naming colors, we know that they're going to have a lot harder time reading fluently. So we can use these underlying neuropsych variables because of the research literature to predict which kids. I can take a group of kindergartners, and in England, you guys teach kids to learn to read a whole lot earlier than anywhere else in the world. And most brains are actually not designed to learn to read as young as the British system wants them to read. In Scandinavia, they start teaching reading at 7, and it takes about 4 weeks, as opposed to banging these poor children's heads against a brick wall at 4 or 5 and doing something that the brains are not really ready to do. But so in neuropsych testing, I can go underneath. If in the States, what I would do is I would go into the local kindergarten classes and we'd measure naming speed. And I could pick out the 20% of kids that were going to have difficulty learning how to read. And we could put them very early on into a reading intervention and teach their brains to read in a way that was going to be easier for them, so that at the end of the day, they never ended up with a reading disability diagnosis. What sorts of referrals do I typically get? All kinds. Sometimes a differential diagnosis. Does this child have an attention deficit? Do they have an anxiety disorder? Do they have a learning disability? Sometimes the diagnostic issue is something acute, something that's happening right now versus something that's been going on for a long time. And when I'm looking at brain activity, I'm looking to see whether the difficulties they're having are focal, is there a particular type of function that they're struggling with, or is it more diffuse? Is it a networked problem? I like to see kids young because I like to get baseline functioning. And then along the way, we can track them and we can see how they're doing, what skills are changing, what things are staying stable. If we've done an intervention, has it had the desired effect? Sometimes I end up in doing a case for the court system that has to do with how disabled a person has become, if they've been in a car accident, they've had a head injury, how much of their difficulties can be attributed to that. That would be a piece of litigation. Sometimes I have to evaluate a child who's been involved in doing something naughty that they shouldn't have done, and how much make some recommendations to the court system about what kind of rehabilitation we should engage in for that child. I've done a number of cases here of kids who've been either victims or perpetrators of sexual crimes. And those are actually incredibly rehabilitative in children. And so it's important to determine whether this is a child who's going to be able to respond to that kind of intervention. Sometimes I'm trying to help people figure out what to do vocationally, what sort of direction to go in. So I just finished an evaluation of a child who is 16, who is in an academic program and whose skill set doesn't support the idea that they're actually going to be able to graduate that program. And we're moving him into a vocational school because he's much more able, he's going to be much more able to create a career for himself that way. And obviously trying to identify these issues helps us figure out what to do. The only point of doing an evaluation is to come up with a plan of action. What are we going to do to help this child or this adult become as happy, productive, and successful as they can be? So understanding the strengths and weaknesses gets us there. So I'm gonna help you understand this about how interesting this area is by giving you 4 case studies of kids these were all kids I saw in my American clinic. And I'm going to have you sort of hold these in mind, but I'll remind you about them later on because that's a lot of information to remember. And we're going to talk about diagnoses. So the first case is a 4-year-old who had difficulty with rhyming and naming, all of the pre-reading deficits. The child was bilingual and pretty distractible. So there was a question here about attention issues and about possible reading issues. The second case, when I did the intake, it was a 7-year-old boy. Parents had recently separated. He'd been in therapy for a year and he kept getting into trouble in school and behaving like a class clown. And there was a lot of focus on his psychological functioning. The third case was an 11-year-old girl who was very depressed. She'd actually made a suicidal attempt just before I had seen her. She was very unmotivated to do her schoolwork. She'd been suspended multiple times from school. She'd been in therapy for 2 years. It wasn't going anywhere. The fourth case is a 19-year-old who had a fairly average high school record. And on the way back home from university in Kansas, back to St. Louis, got stopped by the police for his driving and they found marijuana in his car and he got into some trouble around drug use. And that was the call that that was the incident that precipitated his mom to give me a call. So these are all kids that I evaluated, and I'm not going to give it away now, but I want you to think about what you would, if you were working in this field, what sort of diagnoses you'd be thinking about. Depression, drug addiction, there are all kinds of things going on here. What I will tell you is all 4 of these kids ended up with the same primary diagnosis. Although that seems quite difficult to conceptualize, I'll help you get there. So when we're doing a neuropsychological evaluation, instead of just evaluating 1 or 2 things like the child's IQ and their reading, writing, and math skills, their academic skills, we're doing a very wide range set of tasks. We're looking very comprehensively at all kinds of skills, and we're measuring, obviously, if it's a first evaluation, we're making baseline, but we're obviously going to follow change over time. When I diagnose a particular learning disability and I put an intervention in place, I'm going to measure down the road, a year down the road, has that language intervention or reading intervention produced the required results? Because if it hasn't, we need to change what we're doing. I'm going to compare children to the norm. So all of the tests that we use have a norm base. We know what an average score looks like. We know when people are above average, below average. And that's important because it's important to know if a child's functioning according to their grade level, but also important to look within their own scores to see where their own strengths and weaknesses are. I'm gonna move on from here. I'm just gonna show you the way that we think about the brain as neuropsychologists. We think about the brain sort of like you build a house. The bottom layer of building your house is concrete. You got to pour concrete in order for your walls to stand up straight, all right? If the contractor mixes the concrete and the concrete is soggy, guess what's going to happen to your walls? They keep falling down and you patch them here and you patch them there and you get someone to come fix the electricity and to fix this and fix that. But unless you fix the concrete underneath your house, the walls are not going to stand up straight. From a neuropsychological perspective, attention is the concrete. Working memory sits there too. Working memory is what you can hang on to and manipulate and spit out. For seniors, what we often see is that seniors have a decline in working memory. And how do most of you compensate? You make a list. You might say to yourself when you're in your kitchen, I've got to go to the store and I need to buy these things. But if you don't write them down on a list, when you get to the store, you might say, what was it I was supposed to buy? And you struggle to remember all of the things. If you have good working memory, let's say you want to call a plumber. You're going to open up your yellow pages, or I mean, we don't have yellow pages anymore, but it's a great example. And you're going to repeat the number in your head. You'll dial the number on your phone, and then you dump the information, right? So working memory and attention are our concrete. Above that, the level in the brain are things like how we manipulate information, how we concentrate, how we remember directions, the speed that we learn. And right above that are skills that we observe. Okay, so we observe kids and adults' reading capacity, their math skills, what their language sounds like, what their behavior looks like. Those are the things we're seeing with our eyes, but those are all influenced by the levels underneath. So if I'm working with a child and I've measured their working memory and their attention, and they also have a math problem and a reading problem, I am not going to start my intervention at the top level. I'm going to start building the house with concrete. So I'm going to fix their attention, I'm going to fix their working memory, and then I'm going to be able to fix their reading and their math, which is often very frustrating to parents because they come in, they know the child's got a reading disability and they want to just throw more and more reading intervention at them. But they've usually been doing that for a while anyway before they came to see me, and it's not working. And I explain to them how we're going to intervene. And yes, it's a process. It takes a while, but when we do it right, then we can solve the problem and the problem goes away. What are some of the issues I'm not actually going to talk about this. It's less interesting for you guys. Let me talk about this. What do we do in order to do an assessment? How do we work? First, I have to do a clinical interview. Who do I interview? I start off with parents, and I do not bring the child when I'm evaluating a child. I do not bring the child into the room, because I want at that point to hear from the parent everything that they're concerned about, and I don't need the child to be hearing everything that the parent's concerned about. I'm sometimes going to get teacher information about how the child behaves in school, but I get that less and less because the literature for years now has been telling us something very interesting. Teachers' reports of children are influenced by how attractive the child is, how physically attractive they look, and whether the teacher likes the child. And that usually influences their grade more than anything else. So generally, teacher reports are not particularly useful. If they've had a previous diagnosis, I want to know who diagnosed it and how they diagnosed it. For instance, you can go to a neurologist for an attention diagnosis. The neurologist will ask a few questions. The parent might fill out a behavioral form. And lo and behold, the child crosses the threshold that says they've got an attention problem. From my perspective, that doesn't mean they have an attention deficit disorder. It just tells me that they're having struggles with attention. As a neuropsychologist, I need to go underneath and determine whether it's because they have a language impairment, they don't understand what's going on in the classroom, whether they have an attention problem, whether they're depressed, whether they're anxious, because all of those things will look like an attention problem. In fact, if you look at this slide, all of these things, okay, hearing issues, language issues, head injuries, genetic issues, psychological issues, learning issues, and so on and so forth. What do these all have in common? You're all wondering and thinking nothing that's jumping out to me immediately. They're all mistaken for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I probably undiagnose ADHD as much as I diagnose it. I think this is a disorder that's highly overdiagnosed and highly underdiagnosed. It's wrongly diagnosed in a lot of kids, and it's missed in a lot of other children. Why is it important to pull these things apart? Because I don't want to make an error. What errors do I not want to make? I don't want to make a type 1 error, which is what we call a false alarm, where I'm going to make a diagnosis in a child who is actually normal. Normal is a bad word, a child who's neurotypical. Nor do I want to make a type 2 error, which is where I miss a diagnosis in a child that actually has something that should be diagnosed. So how do we do this? These are all the things that we're going to look at when we do a comprehensive neuropsych evaluation. I'm looking at their academics. I'm looking at their intellect, their abstract reasoning. I'm looking at emotional and personality variables, how their adaptive skills are, their daily living skills. Are they oriented? What are their sensory functions like? Do they hear and see properly? I'm looking at their attention and executive functions, their planning, their organization. And I have lots and lots of tests that can pull all of these things apart in different ways. Their motor skills, language, memory skills. It usually takes me about 6 hours to evaluate a child. I usually split that over 3 2-hour sessions. With younger kids, obviously, we do smaller chunks of assessing. But by the time I'm done and I've pulled all this apart, I'm able to find convergent evidence. I'm not going to, if one test looks a certain way, it becomes then a hypothesis. And I'm going to use other pieces of data to converge to show me that, in fact, this is really an area of disability. So why do we want to label? Why are those labels important? A lot of parents come to me and they say, we don't want to label. Labels are important because when they're made correctly, they help us know what to do. As I said before, the importance of assessing correctly helps us know what we do to help kids. Accurate diagnosis helps us with the right intervention. So let's get back to our kiddos here. These are the 4 kids I mentioned earlier. Every single one of these children, their primary diagnosis was dyslexia. They all had a reading disability. The 4-year-old, who was a pre-reader, I don't know if he ever would have gotten a dyslexia diagnosis, but everything in his neuropsych profile suggested that he would, and he had a family history, and he also had ADHD. So we treated the attention, and then we put him in a reading program designed for dyslexic brains, and the child at the end of the 2nd grade was reading all of the Harry Potter books fluently, meaning that even though the disorder may have been there, it never got diagnosed. When I tested him again at age 10, his word finding, that speed that he could name colors on a page, was really, really slow, meaning that the underlying neurology of dyslexia was clearly present, meaning that had we not intervened when he was young, he would have ended up having a reading diagnosis in school, but we bypassed it. The second case, everyone was so focused on the parents getting divorced that they didn't realize that the reason that this child was acting out in school was because he couldn't read. And he didn't like going to school. He was anxious every day. He was worried that the teacher was going to call on him and have to read in front of the class. And so the therapy was focused entirely on the wrong thing. The 11-year-old girl was particularly interesting. She was an African-American girl in a predominantly Caucasian school. And she was dyslexic, and no one had identified it. I don't know how she managed to get as far as she did in the system. She couldn't read well. And she was very moody and very anxious and depressed. And the focus of the therapy was on her depression, which was completely secondary to her reading disability. The minute we got her into a reading intervention and she developed a sense of self-efficacy that, first of all, she was going to be able to do this. And second of all, there were some grown-ups in her world that were going to help her learn how to read. The mood issues went away. And the 4th case, this was a kid with an incredibly high IQ who only had an average school record. The reason he only had an average school record was because he was quite dyslexic. His reading was very, very slow. And he was failing in university because what do you do the first year of university? In America, university is a little different to England. It's a 4-year program, and the first year is general studies. And it's the introduction to this, an introduction to the other, an introduction to whatever. And each of those textbooks are this thick, and he couldn't keep up with the reading. And his anxiety precipitated some drug use, and he came in around drug use. But again, once we identified the reading issue, we actually pulled him out of university for a semester, put him in a 5-day-a-week reading intervention, and got his reading completely turned around, and he graduated university with a straight A average. So once I figured out what's going on, my next job is to figure out what to do. And the interventions that I use as a scientist have to be theoretically based. They have to make sense. There are lots of things out there, what I call snake oil treatment. People will come up with some kind of intervention and say, this will solve, all of these different problems. A good intervention is going to be very focused. It's going to address just that particular issue, and it will have been studied by people who are friendly and unfriendly, scientists who are skeptical. It's got to withstand comparison to alternative treatments. It's got to be something that works better. And it's also got to be better than what we call waiting list treatment, because guess what? Sometimes people just get better because time passes. It's got to have minimal practitioner effects, meaning it doesn't matter if I send to this therapist or that therapist, the program is easy enough for people to administer in a standardized way. And it's got to be consistent in how we understand the brain to work. So what are the kinds of interventions that work? One of the important principles is something called mass practice. So I don't know if any of you know anyone who's had a stroke, but when someone has a stroke and let's say they lose language function, they're going to go to language therapy every day for a period of time until they recover their language skills. Once their language skills are recovered, they don't need to keep going to therapy, because what the mass practice has done is when we do something repetitively day after day, we're growing neurons, we're growing brain cells that are making new connections. And once those connections are made and we can use them, we don't need to keep necessarily building them, continuing to build them. We just need to exercise them. Sometimes we're going to be looking at interventions that are learning interventions. The intervention I'm going to talk to you about in a little bit, CogMed, is a cognitive intervention. It's an evidence-based cognitive rehabilitation program for people who have working memory difficulties. That means anyone with ADHD, anyone who's gone through chemotherapy, the aging population, and there are a whole collection of other disorders where an illness may affect the working memory cells in the brain. There are a bunch of other things out there. Learning Breakthrough, which works on cerebellar systems, which is our movement system. There's a program called MC Squared, which is a great learning program. It's something that was developed by a colleague of mine in Scottsdale, Arizona. And it involves a lot of bilateral integration. Neurofeedback and biofeedback are the sorts of interventions that we can use to change the way the brain operates. Psychotherapy is helpful, learning all kinds of techniques that you can use to reduce anxiety, to improve your mood. And parenting training is really important. I often have people want to send their 5, 6, and 7-year-old kids to therapy, and I tell them they get a whole lot more bang for their buck if they actually do the work themselves. It's far easier to train the parents than it is to teach the child when most of the issues are probably coming from the way they're being parented. And then here I'm going to tell you a little bit more about CogMed, and I'll see if I can grab a demo and put it on the screen. So I mentioned earlier the brain's concrete and working memory being at the bottom of the bottom supporting function for the house. So working memory is the key for the way that our brain processes information. I'll give you an example for how it applies to learning. Let's say a child is doing a math equation and they have to add up in columns and they have to carry numbers. If they can't hang on to the operation they just did and they move on to the next column and they've forgotten what they just did, they're going to get the sum wrong. If a child is reading and they can't hang on to the characters in the story, they're not going to be able to follow the flow. In daily life, these are the kids whose parents will say to them, I want you to go and do these 3 or 4 things. And on the way to doing the first thing, they get distracted by something else and they forget everything they've just been told to do. So it's really important. Working memory is important because it keeps you focused on what you're doing. It's important for concentration and for resisting distractions. And the CogMed intervention, which was developed in Sweden, has had a proven impact on working memory and attention. In fact, there are over 100 peer-reviewed published journal articles about this intervention. I've been doing it now since the mid-90s, and it's really nice as a neuropsychologist, not just to tell parents that their child has a working memory dysfunction, but to actually say that we can fix it, which we do. And the effects are long lasting. The research shows that once we've changed the way, once we've grown these neurons in a child's brain or in an adult's brain, the effect stays. I've done this intervention with kids as young as 5, and my oldest client was 82. And he'd already been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. When he came to me to do this intervention, he was sent because he was visiting his daughter locally. And I had done this intervention with her teenage son, and she had called me to ask whether it might help her dad. And I looked in the literature. I hadn't worked with too many seniors at that point, and there was good evidence that it was helpful. 3 weeks into this 6-week program, his wife called me saying that he had played bridge the night before, something that he hadn't been able to do for the previous 3 years, and that she got her husband back. She was able to have conversations with him that she had previously not been able to have. So we actually got him, he did have Alzheimer's dementia. We got him probably another 1.5 years of decent cognitive function that I don't think he would have had he not done CogMed. So it's not going to stop an Alzheimer's dementia, but it's certainly going to slow down the process. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen. And I'm going to pull up, if I can, see if I can pull up a CogMed. No, I'm not sure where that is. One moment, let me just minimize my screen so I can open up CogMed, and then I'll be able to share it with you. Okay, so now let's see if it's going to let me do it. Hang on a minute. Technology is not my strength. So let's see. Okay, here. Now we're going to do this. Okay. So can you see the CogMed screen? Can someone just tell me whether you can see whether it says the new CogMed?
Yes, we can. Okay,
so I'm going to show you the tryout of what it looks like. Okay, so this would be the, I'm going to select this version. This would be the adult version that we use. For instance, this would be one of the exercises where it would start by lights clicking. And then it's showing you that you have to click them in the same order. And then you do it. And it makes a little happy sound to say that you've done it right. And it keeps going on and the span increases. So it pushes you out to the level of items that you can hold in your working memory. I'm going to show you an auditory one. This one is going to work on auditory working memory. Again, when we're doing it at a level of stimuli of two things, it's not very complex. It's not very difficult, but it gets complex fast.
1, 2.
And then it's going to reverse them. So you've got to click them in the reverse order that you heard them. Okay. So now we'll do the next trial.
6, 7.
And you have to click in the backwards order. And you can see on this table over here, it's going to keep increasing the level. So very quickly, already on the first day of training, people are being pushed out to levels of 4, 5, and 6. And by the second day of training, they're right out at their level of capacity, and we just keep pushing it. And it interactively adapts each day. So if you fail a trial, it'll bring you down. And if you pass one, it pushes you a bit further. And we do this 5 days a week for 6 weeks. So it's a very intensive program, but it brings about the kinds of change that we want. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. That was just an example. There are nine or 10 games that are in that program, and it's always set up by a clinician, monitored by a clinician, and coached by a clinician, and that's why it works. So hopefully that's been interesting. Those are the kinds of things I spend my days doing. I love what I do. I think every person that comes into my office is a unique puzzle, and my job is to figure out how to work with that puzzle, optimize their skills and take their weaknesses and help them stop being weaknesses. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, Alyson, thank you for that. That's extremely interesting and fascinating. We often say to our people that the objective of SAGE is to entertain and educate. And I think you've done both today. That certainly has. I think I might write to our Minister for Education, Gavin Williams, and suggest that teachers ought to be phoning their children up every day to wake them up. And you know, I think the unions might have something to say, but I think some parents would be absolutely delighted.
Yes,
well,
I've abdicated responsibility. I'm out of the house before he needs to get up for Zoom anyway. So she seems to be willing to do it. Why not?
But I do like the idea you talked about learning another language and how that could be a good stimulus for the brain. Maybe that's something that more mature people need to think about. And certainly when you get onto the COSMED, it's a very interesting exercise. And as you suggested, it possibly can help, perhaps delay the onset. Is that what you're suggesting in terms of that?
Yeah, it also just helps with basic things that anyway decline as we age. I mean, I think we all get better at making lists as we get older. I had a family once where I worked with 2 of the teenagers. They did the program. They had ADHD, and the dad was an emergency room doctor, and he was in his mid-60s. And he called me up one day and he said, "Do you think it would help? Because when I'm in the ER, I'm losing my memory bubbles. I have to calculate quickly how much medicine to be pumping into the IV line, and I keep losing my calculations. And I said that, yeah, that it would help. He came, did the program, and I'm a scientist. So when someone does an intervention, I test at the end to make sure that I've actually improved the thing that I'm supposed to be improving. And I called him up and I said, can I schedule your follow-up visit so we can test your working memory? And he said, okay, he said, I'll humor you, but I can tell you right now that my working memory bubbles stopped popping. I'm not having the problem that I was having before. So it did what it was supposed to do. And of course I tested it and it had done it. But those are the kinds of things that really are, I think, make a difference. They're small interventions. They build a particular set of neurons and they change day-to-day functioning.
Fascinating. Okay, right. Let's open it up to questions then for Alyson. Right, who have we got down? Peter.
Rita.
Oh, Rita, sorry. Is it Rita down there?
Unmute, please.
You're on mute, Rita.
Unmute.
Okay, you're on now.
Hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I just would like to ask a question. Do you think it's a better way of teaching, like the Israeli way, where the children call their teacher by first name? Does it work better? Does the teacher get more respect, or does it get respect at all? Or is it a better way than the teaching we're doing probably in America, like you said, or in the UK?
So I think it's a really cultural question. I don't think better is necessarily the way that I would think about it. I would just think about it as different. It depends what you want to achieve. If the thing that you want to achieve is very high level of respect of children to teachers, I think children have less respect when they call their teachers by their first name. At the same time, I know in Israel that if a child's got a problem, let's say they've got something really terrible going on at home, the fact that they have that level of closeness with their teacher means that they've got a grown-up that they're much more likely to share their difficulty with. And I think there's a much bigger emphasis in Israel on the social emotional growth of children in school than there is on academic growth. If something happens on the playground in Israel amongst kids, it's going to be addressed right after recess in the classroom. And even if it means they're not going to have their math lesson, but they're going to deal with what's going on between those children, it gets dealt with. And so we have a lot of people who graduate school here who are very good at working in teams. They know how to get along with each other well. They're very sociable. And if you look at today's world, I think those are skills that people need to have. I think that we can get a lot of learning from the internet now. I mean, if perhaps if we don't learn all the things we need to learn in history, is it the end of the world? If we have basic learning skills and we can get along well with people and we learn how to reason well, it just depends on what your emphasis is in your education system. So I don't think one's better than the other. I just think they have different emphases. It depends where it's culturally based.
Thank you. Right, who else? Any other more questions?
There's a lady there called Shirley. Unmute
Okay,
yourself, please, Shirley. Unmute.
Fascinating. Have you got a suggestion for helping learning? I've always been very good at languages, and even at 85, I'm learning new languages. But my maths is very poor and always has been. And really, my computer skill is not good. Now, what can you recommend to improve that? I'm a list maker by the time.
First of all, kudos for all of you for figuring Zoom out. You've learned lots of skills in the last year. I'm sure that that you didn't have before. You can put yourself in and out of group conversations, mute, unmute, turn your cameras on and off. These are all good things, good skills to have. You probably have a little bit of a math learning disability. And I would say probably at 85, it's unlikely to get a lot better. And so I would recommend a bypass using a calculator or having someone else balance your checkbook if that's what you're struggling with. And I would say work with the things that are working well for you. If you've managed to get to 85 with poor math and you've done okay in life, then you're fine. You just find a workaround technique. If you were 10 and in the school system, I wouldn't necessarily be giving up on your math skills, but I think it's probably, practice makes perfect. Maths practice makes perfect. So if you want to sit down and do a lot of math exercises, then you might improve your math skills. As far as computer use is concerned, I would do the same thing. Just keep repeating or having someone show to you until you get the hang of it. Because repetition is what changes the way our neurons fire. We neuropsychologists have a very wonky saying. We say that neurons that fire together wire together. So if you keep practicing something, the neurons fire together and then they're going to wire and then you're going to have a skill.
Okay, can we go to Leslie Daniels and then Joy? Leslie, go on.
Unmute.
Hi. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I would like to pick up on one thing that you said. As you probably know, in this country at the moment, our grandchildren are not going to be sitting their public exams. I was horrified to hear you say how influenced their results might be by how attractive they were and how popular they were with the teacher. And is there anything that can be done in the situation that our kids find themselves in now to mitigate against this?
I don't know. I think that when we get to the level of public exams, and we're talking about GCSEs and it used to be O levels and A levels when I took them. I don't know what they're called now. But at that level, a lot of the work is more objective, and it is graded in England by outside examiners. And so those influences have a little bit less of a role. The stuff that they do in school, the part of the schooling that is graded by their teachers, I encourage parents, grandparents, and whoever's involved, if you think that a child's work has been unfairly graded, then you should appeal it. And you should help your children and your grandchildren, or in your case, grandchildren, learn how to make nice with their teacher.
This year, it's a real problem because they will absolutely be graded on their teachers' say-so. And
Yeah.
Quite scary. I mean,
it is a bit scary. It's a little more relevant with elementary school kids than it is for high school kids. High school teachers are a little more immune to this, but it's really the elementary school teachers that will quickly dislike the little boy who's bouncing around their classroom, driving them nuts, 7 or 8. In high school, and especially in England, where there's a much better sense of decorum and respect, I don't think it'll have as much effect. But you should always appeal if you think a child's work has been unfairly evaluated.
Okay, Joy, and then I think we've got Glenda Hirsch after that. Joy?
Yes, hi Alyson, that was absolutely fascinating. My question is about losing words when you speak, forgetting names, comes with age. And as someone who was fairly fluent and used to enjoy conversation, I find now I'm looking around for words, or I forget halfway through what I'm saying. So can your CogMed thing that you were talking about earlier, can that help?
Word retrieval is really a longer, it's a different kind of memory system. And so I'm not sure that improving your working memory will help you fish words that you're having trouble finding. The best thing that you can do, quite frankly, is read. Reading improves the fluidity of your vocabulary and maintains vocabulary development, and that makes it easier to pull words out of your lexicon. So read or listen to TED Talks or programs that have good language. In terms of face recognition, try and find something to tag the name to. Try and make an association. So that it's easier to picture, try and use a visual association so it's easier to picture the name. That might help.
Thank you.
Or accept the aging process as well a little bit. Right, Glenda Hirsch, you've put your hand up.
Could you unmute, please?
Glenda, you're on mute.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Alyson, for a fascinating talk. What I'm interested in, when you worked in America, what happened about funding? Will most of the children come from private? Would it be private funding? And if it wasn't, what happens with children who had these problems but didn't have the means to get the financial assistance?
So unfortunately, even in Israel, my clinic's private. There are public services available. You can get tested through your local, through the local, here it would be the education support structure that you can get tested. I personally don't think they know what they're doing here, but that's an entirely different discussion because their training is bad and they're about 30 years behind the times. I think it's a case, unfortunately, it really is a case of, like in most medical, with medical practitioners, you kind of get what you pay for. And it does mean that people have to budget to be able to sometimes to do these kinds of evaluations or interventions. We do, wherever we can, we try to involve public services. Here we have national health insurance. And so when I'm referring someone for an intervention, I'm going to look to see if we can find someone in their health fund that's actually going to be able to do the intervention. And if not, we often, those of us that are working privately will often work with people on payment plans and what have you, so that if they don't, they're not able to afford it all at once, that they can pay for it over a period of time. But it's unfortunate that the world works this way. I mean, I personally always do pro bono cases. I always will take on a number of cases each year that these are families that wouldn't be able to afford the services. That's what I feel is my ethical responsibility, and most of my colleagues do the same thing. But it means that we can't help everybody, and we have to, we do our best. But the systems don't work as well as they should.
Thank you.
Can we do one more quick question for you? Sure. Brian, Nathan? Just last question.
It's actually me, Judy.
Okay, Judy. Make it quick.
Can you unmute? Sorry. Unmute.
Yeah, I have a dear friend who is 85 and recently had a stroke, and he's lost his ability to speak coherently. Is his age against him for getting his speech back?
So the brain becomes a little less plastic as we age. I don't know the details of his stroke, so it's a little hard for me to, I'd need to see some images to help me understand exactly where the stroke damage is. But the best thing that he can do is daily speech and language intervention with a speech pathologist, and speech pathologists will be best able to determine what the likelihood is of language recovery. Certainly age doesn't help, but it's not a complete impediment to recovering language. What would be more important to know is the extent of the stroke and the location of the stroke, and how far, how extended it was in his temporal lobe, which is the part of the brain that governs language.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have Shlomo.
Shlomo, if you've got a quick question, because we agreed.
1 minute and then I've got to run.
She's got a minute to
Okay,
go. So
very good, very quick
quick
question. Brilliant talk. My brother's a psychotherapist, so I was particularly interested. Question. I speak a few languages. I want to learn another one. I'm recently retired. I've got in mind Russian. Any comments?
Choose one you're interested in.
Russian.
Then learn Russian.
Thank
there
you.
you are.
God bless you.
Answer, and we finished at 3 o'clock. Alyson, thank you so much for that. Thank you for your time.
It was an absolute pleasure. And
one quick question for me. Have you had both jabs?
Of course I have. I mean, we're going here. We've got everything going. My kids have had both jabs.
Wow. It's the main point of conversation in the UK at the moment. Yes. So thank you so much. Keep well and keep safe.
And I'll send my slides over. I'll send them over by email. My contact information is there. If anyone wants to follow up, you're welcome to be in touch.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay well.
Stephanie saying thank you very much. Thank you, Alyson. Oh, she's gone. She's gone.
Okay, just before you all disappear, current affairs as usual this Thursday at 2 o'clock. Malcolm Blayberg's in charge for that. And next Tuesday we have Dawn Waterman and Miriam Grabina. It's International Women's Day. She's from the Board of Deputies, Archives and Heritage Manager. Will be talking to us about the Board's Treasures Project. So another interesting afternoon coming up for you. So Thursday, current affairs. Next Tuesday, Dawn Waterman. Look forward to seeing you all then. Keep well and enjoy the sun.
Bye, everybody.